Blessings and welcome back, everyone, to our look at Demetra George's second volume of Ancient Astrology. I am here today with Matt Nolan from the Astrologer's Encyclopedia and David Fisher again. Hello, David, from In the
Hello,
First Place
Elsa.
Astrology. Thanks for being here, both of you again. So this is the second of our series going over, like I said, Demetra George's second volume of Ancient Astrology. We're going to kind of keep you guys abreast here on YouTube with little kind of snippets of what we're doing in our Patreon group. So each month we come together and we look at a few chapters and go through it together, look at examples, encourage each other, motivate each other, and inspire each other. So if you want to get together with us, you can check us out over on Patreon. Otherwise, we will just kind of be keeping you up to date here on YouTube as well. So this month we are going over the first house and the second house in Demetra's books, which is chapter 64 and chapter 65 respectively. Do you guys want to say anything before we go ahead and dive into the overview?
Oh, just don't forget to like, subscribe, all the YouTube good stuff that you guys know how to do well.
Quick note, just on chapter 63, she has like a 2-page chapter to just introduce the 12 houses. And she makes a couple of points that, like, the word topic is related to topoi, which is like the phrase that was used to describe the houses in ancient times. So you also get things like topography. It's like the lay of the land, the lay of topics in a person's life. And she also makes a point that it's really important where if you're coming from a modern astrology background to, while you're learning this, just kind of like take the planet and sign and house associations and put them over here. Do your best to learn this on its own terms, to learn it as if you had never learned anything about astrology before, because this was the original way to think about it, and the planetary associations, while they're not necessarily wrong, are just a new development that should be put aside. Learn this and then do what you want.
Yeah, as far as the modern paradigm. And I think, you know, what's cool about Demetra's book is she includes authors from Hermes Trismegistus and Thrasyllus, which are the earliest sources that we have, all the way up through the modern sources. So it is really good to see it chronologically and to have an understanding. But we personally are going to be sticking with, you know, we're going to be probably sticking from Hermes Trismegistus up through, what did I say? Maybe the
Pretorius.
Through Pretorius. We're probably not even going to get into the Arabic authors because they slowly start to trickle into the medieval stuff. But she does have them there. And it is really cool if you're coming from medieval, or if you're coming from William Lilly, or if you're coming from modern astrology or something like that, to see how they develop through time. And you might get some of the you might be able to see the reflection when we're talking about the earlier sources as to how you can sort of develop your mind forward into the modern paradigm to see like how those came about. But we're going to focus on like the earliest possible way to think about it, and it gets you thinking a lot deeper about like some of the rich core substantive meanings, instead of like, you know, as you go, you get people thinking, oh, well, this pretty much means that, so it means this, you know. Or you see like, oh, well, derived houses, like a lot of the like names or the significations for the houses come from derived houses as well. So you get, if you really steep and learn in the ancient authors why the houses were associated the way that they were, and you start to get that really in your bones, it helps you interpret the rest of it as well. So it has so much value on its own, and once it really sinks in, you can start to reflect it to whatever modality you use in astrology. But yeah, like Matt said, it's super valuable to take it at its own in its own right, instead of trying to be like, oh, well, this is why, and then like try to mesh it all the way to like why moderns will say what they say about it. It's like, just take it at its own value. Just let yourself simmer in the significations that we have before you start to automatically make associations and automatically derive things and stuff like that. It'll make it easier for your brain, and it's rich and it's deep.
Well, and it's like you said, there's the significations are similar for the most part, but they're just arrived at through a different path. And the ancient path is, to me, much more interesting because it has nothing to do with the signs and the planets, like in the way that it is in modern. And so there's just a much more complex structure to like build your significations around.
Yeah, you know, that's really interesting as well, because that's exactly right. You're stripping away the signs, you're stripping away the planets. You know, we will be talking today about where planets take their joys and in the houses and why, but that's what's cool about it. And why is the cool part, right? So the houses have their own kind of meaning, even though the houses, even in whole sign houses, the houses are the signs, but they're also independent of the signs. So it is fun to look at them in their own right. So, okay, that being said, that top boy topical notes being covered, are you guys ready to jump into the first house? So the intro to the first house, hour marker or the horoscopos. So Rhetorius began his discussion of the houses not with the first house, but with the 12th house, because it was the house of childbirth. So as the mother is laboring before this moment of birth, the time that is passing is like rising up into the 12th house, which is really beautiful to conceptualize when you're talking about the point of birth. The joy and relief of a birth is metaphorically heralded with the sound of a trumpet. Sextus Imperius includes an image of a man sitting beside a woman in labor and marked the time of birth by means of a gong. If you can imagine, a baby's born, boom, the gong rings. A Chaldean astrologer sits on a peak watching the stars, and upon hearing the gong, he notes the rising sign. It's kind of a really beautiful way to get an almost precise moment of embodiment, isn't it? To think of it in that sense. The first house is considered the strongest house, both in terms of favorability and in terms of angularity. And I just wanted to note here that these notes are coming directly from Demetra's book. They're not like, I guess, exact quotes, but they're pretty precise as to how they're written in the book. So I just want you to know that these are not coming from me. They're just like excerpts that I'm taking from Demetra's book. It also signifies Zoe, the physical life of the body, and it represents birth and youth, which is interesting when we'll get to Mercury. And it forms the main reference point and the foundation for the entire chart. And we were talking earlier, and Matt, you had some more to say, and we'll probably end up kind of like driving that point home, because that point, or that Saimeon, that moment of birth, and the first house is the whole reason why we would look at the other houses at all, is how it is in relation to the native. How is the native's money? How's the native's family? So the whole horoscope comes from, and even the word horoscope comes from this hour marker, right? Like the moment that it's born, and then the whole horoscope unfolds. So that's really important. That is why it's the most favorable. That is why it's the most angular. It represents that moment. It represents you, that embodiment.
Right. And I like to think of the chart depicting or being like a spoken image of the life rather than the native, because the native is contained within the life. And then, like you were saying, we have the first house is the native, we have the 10th house being what the native does and the bearing that has on the native, the 7th house being the person that the native marries and the bearing that has on the native, and so forth. So it's like, you could then extend it and say, well, okay, the second house is self-worth or self-esteem or these kinds of things, but it's always still in reference to the self, the native, the person.
Yeah, even if we were going psychologically and saying, you know, giving the psychological descriptions,
Perspective.
We would still be looking at it in reference to the person you're talking about. And it's interesting to think of it not just as the person, but as the life. I really do like that. And we're going to go on. That's supported by everything Demetra says, right? It signifies the life of the native, both in terms of body and character. The Greeks called it was called horoscopos, meaning the hour marker, which we covered. The Greek word pneuma is also used to reference the first house, and it means breath or spirit, which a little bit talks like what you were saying, Matt, about it's the life. It's not necessarily even the nativity or you yourself. It's actually the spirit or the life that is embodied in this wheel, in this play.
And
So
if you think, especially like in whole sign houses, and maybe that's what you're getting at, is that it's the meeting between sky and earth. So if you have whole sign houses, let's say this is the house, rising degree is right here in the middle of it. Part of it's below, part of it's above. And so this is the point where like the breath first enters the body and the spirit is like enlivened within the physical shell.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, Zoe and pneuma together refer to the breath of life and the quality of the soul that is infused into the physical body at the moment of birth. I thought that was interesting, the quality of the soul. And now we're judging the qualities of souls and stuff. David, go ahead.
I was going to say that the first house, or the horizon plane, is where everything comes to be in the east. But primarily, you begin the day when you see the sun, the primary light, what defines day and night, coming up on the horizon, and you can tell, and everything suddenly is illuminated, right? The same way when the native comes forth into the world and becomes something in its own right, something that is developing according to the environment. The whole promise of what that native can become, much like when the sun rises, is contained in that one moment of the rising, of the coming to being of that one thing. And it's all those promises that will develop throughout the native's life, and that ascendant point will mark the way that that native will bring those promises to completion. But that one moment is the moment where something is spoken into being, and that speech kind of just reverberates throughout the native's life.
Yeah, exactly. And that whole, I guess this will start to unfold too. So I'm just going to take us here now. On page, for those of you who are following along with the book, on page 645, there's a lot of juice in this chapter on page 645. So there was a few paragraphs that I was like almost like thinking I could highlight like all of this stuff to bring to you guys. So I think we're going to kind of split up those 3 paragraphs and take some points from it. So it's going to start us out talking about a little bit of what Matt alluded to. So you've got this whole first house, but the ascendant is floating within the first house. And we have the first house not only called the horoscope, but called the helm, or the joy of Mercury. So why is it the joy of Mercury here? Why is Mercury in the helm and in the first house? Well, Mercury is also this being that goes between the worlds, just how the ascendant is below the horizon for some portion and above the horizon for some portion in the first house. It kind of shows that liminal space, that mercurial space of being able to be in the realm of matter and spirit. So yeah, that's where Mercury rejoices. Rhetorius calls it the star of Hermes when presented in the first house, because of the divine spirit takes form through the word, or logos. Our teacher tells us to say logos, Robert Schmidt. So if you hear us saying that, we're not mispronouncing. It's not the common pronunciation, but when we say logos, it's just because Robert Schmidt tells us to say it that way, or logos. I'll probably use them both so that people know what we're talking about. So if we're talking about the Star of Hermes rejoicing here, because spirit and the word. Yeah, what the Gospel of John, in the Gospel of John, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So that word, meaning logos, it's like when you take the spirit and give it form through sound, because Shiva, he who creates through sound or whatever, it gives a voice to something that's living. And then she goes on to say, the first house denotes the body, speech, the beginning of all action, the beginning of one's mind. Mercury in the first house is the power of speech and oratory. What am I saying? There we go. Thank you. So then the words Zoe and Fuma, life and spirit, were this common pairing in the New Testament literature, as well as many of the Hellenistic texts, because we have the life and spirit connected to logos, because spirit becomes manifest on earth, not only through one's bodily actions, but also through the words that one speaks, or through, even if you go subtler, through the words that one might think. And then she goes on to say, the Buddhist teachings stress the importance of a precious human rebirth. And the body gives life a place where the spirit can reside and form, or which it can take action. It's only while inhabiting the human body that we can actually attain spiritual enlightenment, or we can become realized. So in this way, the rejoicing of Mercury represents the union of the physical body and the divine mind. And Plato calls this the soul, and Valens calls this the spirit.
I really like this because it stresses the idea of, and the thought that I was thinking was, if we have this image of above and below the horizon of spirit sort of joining into matter, like that is, period, that is the human experience, right? That is, and according to what else I was just saying with the Buddhist teachings of the human incarnation being unique in that it has this special access to spirit through the mind and through the word. And so that would be the first house. And so it's presenting us with an image of, no matter what else is relevant in the life as depicted in the rest of the placements in the birth chart, we are all this combination of physical body with divine spirit. Yeah, and so the third paragraph on this same page on 645 basically just brings that point home again of, in the whole sign system, we have part of it above, part of it below. So the human is a mercurial character, and that it can traverse above and below in terms of matter and spirit, in terms of known and unknown, in terms of light and dark.
Exactly, like we are the bridge. We are the ability to attain enlightenment, or logos, or understanding, or spirit and matter. Like that's why it is precious. That's why human birth is precious.
And that's a unique, so it seems, ability that we have, is to take things in our mind and bring them into physical reality. That's like the human trait. It's very valuable and very beautiful. So the next paragraph on 645, it's the last one that goes a little bit into 646, talks about, she says, another important name used by Hellenistic astrologers for the first house is oiax, forgive my Greek, the handle of a rudder or tiller, the steering wheel of a ship, translated in some texts as helm. In classical iconography, Tuke, or Fortuna, the goddess of chance and fortune, often held a rudder in one hand. The term suggests that the first house was also understood as the way by which we steer our lives to its destiny or destination. Planets in the first house have their hands on the steering wheel of our ship of life, and the lord of the first house is the steersperson who directs the course of the life journey. So we were talking about this earlier, and Elsa, you in particular really love this image of, like, we have our hand on the steering wheel of our lives, but so does fortune, and so does any planets in the first house, that kind of thing. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
And just that 2K has her hands on the helm, I just thought that was a beautiful way of thinking about it. And just has all this like layered signification to the idea of, and how we've got these ideas of, fate and free will, or fate and fortune, and how, 2K has her hand also on the wheel, or also on the helm, or that's where we get that helm signification from. I just thought that was gorgeous. I loved it.
Right. And I really like too, it's like you can imagine the image of like the soul entering the body and the rising sign and the planets on the ascendant being like the attendants that are setting up and like planning out the life of the native. So it's like if you have Mars on the ascendant, or you're born with Scorpio rising, Mars has his hand on the wheel, and that's going to indicate certain events and outcomes that are different from if you have Venus on the wheel. And it just indicates a different course of life depending on what planets are there, where the ruler is, and so forth.
One way to think about it is literally the way the person moves. when they are trying to achieve something, and what kind of energies they draw from when trying to enact their will into the world.
Yeah, and even if you don't have a planet there in the first house, just the signification of the first house in general, or the lord of the first house, or the sign that inhabits the first house, everyone has that. And that's why we look at it being a special signification. So should we move on to house 2?
Sure.
So chapter 2, the second house, or the gate of Hades. The second house is a complex, or Demetra says, these are Demetra's words that I've taken out from notes. So this is all coming again from her. The second house is a complex and contradictory, or has complex and contradictory implications. On the one hand, it's a succedent house of moderate strength and support associated with the native's livelihood and money, coupled with hopes and expectations for increase. On the other hand, it's classified as dark and shaded, an unfavorable place because it's in an aversion to the descendant. And no planets rejoice here. The second house incorporates hope for, or like forevermore hope for more prosperity, more material possessions, to satisfy this underlying need of basic livelihood.
And we can go a little bit deeper into the succedent places, angularity and all of that, and how much energy those places give. But those two, the 8th and the second houses, the gates of Hades, they're both averse to the ascendant. They don't make any aspects to that place. And so they are things that are conducive to business in our lives, but that we have to constantly be making ourselves aware of, because we can't foresee future events to an extent that we'll be prepared for everything. We will be forced by chance and fate to make choices that jeopardize our best interests sometimes, because it's choosing the lesser of two evils. And so being able to keep balance within circumstance, unlike focusing on material things so you can have enough for unforeseen events, and not getting lost in that so you don't lose your sense of self, your spiritual direction, and what you really want to do with your life and existence, so that you don't lose that focus within, trying to acquire material wealth in order to be able to do that, So it's like people identify too much with the things within the second house. They can get lost and not reach the first house promises, that include the self-knowledge, self-awareness, knowing yourself, and becoming more attuned with how you enact yourself into the world, because you're too focused in the second house matters. And so that's why those houses, they are gates of Hades. They allow things to, especially the second house, which is the one that we're focusing on, that one allows things to come out of the underworld, or the world of the ideas, the bottom part of the chart, into the world of the first house, where you can enact those ideals into reality.
And we're going to talk about that more, like the getting stuck in the second, as we move through what a few things Demetra says about it. But she's saying, if we have like the moment where the sun rises, right, like that rebirth, when we're thinking about the second place, it starts to rise out of this subterranean place near the lowest heaven, and it's pushing towards, or reaching towards, the ascendant. And the second house is just before sunrise. And that saying, like, it's darkest before the dawn, or something like that, right? It's the coldest and the darkest, like it's the last hours of night before, and then you start to see it lightening and lightening and lightening, and then all of a sudden, maybe some of the animals are moving around, and you're starting to get like prepped for the day, and then boom, all of a sudden the sun hits the scene in the first house or whatever. So you have this kind of, again, liminality space of like, you can't really see the sun yet, but those early morning hours are dawning, essentially, and it's being sort of, the sun has come from the darkest place, which was its place of death, to be born again and born anew. So it's almost like it's being born, or first seen right out of the gates of Hades, almost like the gates of hell are letting free our king, essentially in this space, or it's being, it's at the threshold of the gates bursting out of hell, essentially, with just the way the movement of the sun comes from the fourth house and up to the first in that quarter.
The second as the place of that follows after the first. So the second would be the place where, once you're born, you got to figure out what to do to sustain your life. So that's where we get significations of livelihood. Demetra says that they associate it with bios, which is just like zoe is another word that means life, but it's a different kind of life, where zoe is like the individual life of a person or a spirit or a soul or something like that. And bios would be like life in general. So we have the second being this communal experience, but it's also a way that like we all partake of this sustaining of the physical body, which for most people is pretty much the same. And it just it's a very difficult process. And like David was saying, it's unpredictable. It's very, very subject to chance. We don't really understand long-term how we're going to keep doing it always. And it's this place that needs to constantly be like reevaluated, and can lead to things like stockpiling resources, stealing from others, making sure that I have enough versus you, those kinds of things.
And going into, I think that's what you're going to bring up, Elsa, next by our outline, that we're going to talk about the passage in Matthew after the Mount Sermon. But back to the second house,
real place. Like if you
Yeah.
go on YouTube, there's people that researched it. There was like maybe gases that were let out of this spring that if you did get too close, you would inhale these gases and you could actually die there. And that's why they called it the Gate of Hades. It's the foot of the Mount Hermon in Israel. It's this large cliff known as the Rock of the Gods, and it was like a huge pagan place, important place. At the mouth of this cave, there was a base of this cliff that emerged, apparently the underworld. There was like a spring there, but it contains shrines, which I think is really interesting, to Pan, who is like the horned goat god, right? Which is like, the devil in Christian, whatever. And shrines to Pan and the nymphs were considered to hang out there. And it was considered to be like a pagan or degenerate place. And he proclaimed, Peter, you on this rock, I will build my church, and the gate of Hades will not overcome it.
They will always be aware. They will not fall prey to these material, deceiving, treacherous, spirits that will only keep them stuck in materiality.
Yeah, she says that Hades was the abode of Pluto, and Pluto was the god of wealth. So she was saying that Jesus's intention with this was to say that the church should remain uncorrupted by immoral financial practices that were associated with the pagan god of wealth, who resided in hell, or resided in Hades. So the god of wealth resided there in Hades, so that he didn't, you hear those stories about turning over the tables of the, traders or something. And you get this same thing, this adage of money being the root of all evil. So it casts its shadow of unfavorability into the second house, being this, underworld figure.
And I see evil here as ignorance, really. It would be this place that doesn't allow you to really understand who you are to the fullest, because it keeps you within circumstance, only stuck to the things that are not you, and to the things that are deviate your focus from that.
And it's a place that does not relate to and rejects the spirit of the native. So it's like important and necessary, and it will support the native's journey, but it is not itself supportive of, and it doesn't reference the spirit of the native in the same way as other houses do.
Yeah, and it talks about after we feed ourselves and we have basic shelter and basic food or whatever, it gets complicated almost instantly as to what is a need and what is a desire. So the second house topic speaks to one's relationship to wealth. It doesn't necessarily have to, and this is gonna tip spiritual or tip into corruption really quickly, as maybe not spiritual, but these bigger ideas, because it's not necessarily if the person is rich or if the person is poor. It's these ideas of richness and poverty are here, but beyond that, it describes, and this is Demetra kind of like, you know, her idea is to delineate these things for us, right? So it describes our financial habits, whether it's generosity or being miserly, whether it's saving or spending, whether it's wise or reckless. And this is all, again, right here at this point of the chapter, we're still talking about materiality, right? We're still talking about, am I rich, am I poor, am I greedy, am I generous? But those concepts are then going to spiral more into like ideas that have to do with like hopes and expectations of gain, and also for like, if someone has a hope for more, like those hopes, we're always hoping for more and more prosperity. There's never a time where we're like, I'll take less prosperity or something like this. So it's the idea of like material possessions as the underlying needs of basic livelihood, and then what can easily lead to the accumulation of wealth, financial greed, and other grave difficulties of the human condition. So then she asks us, you know, a few questions here. So is this person possessive or grasping? Like if you're looking at a chart, right, and you're looking at your own second house and you're thinking about like, what are we looking at here? Yes, it supports the native. Yes, the native doesn't have much access to it, or they have, like David was saying, yes, they might have to like try to bring in consciousness there. Like if you think about finances, we're always in a blind spot, whether they're ours or whether they're somebody else's. Like a lot of people just don't want to look at that part of themselves, or don't have access to it, how possessive they really are, how grasping they really are, how generous or sharing, and what do they have? Do they hoard their possessions? Do they pass them on when they're no longer needed? How many rooms in storage lockers are filled? If this person is financially dependent on their partner or on their parents for survival, and if so, does that compromise one's own integrity and personal freedom? So you're looking at all of those things, and obviously, you know, when we get to the 8th house, we're going to look at it from another perspective of this same polarity. And essentially what we're saying is the shadow side of the 2nd house, which is more apt than not to rear its head, I guess. There's a danger with identifying oneself with one, or your worth with one's own net worth, essentially, is the big pitfall here of it. Instead of looking at the life as a spirit soul, it's all of a sudden, what's my worth? What's my net worth? And then when we move beyond this fundamental need for financial security, those ethical questions about money can arise. And then she has us moving on to looking at what is the true nature of livelihood. What are the activities associated with money making, and are they in accordance with one's own values? So I guess those are the big questions of like kind of trying to bring that awareness that David was talking about into the 2nd house. Like, am I my net worth? Or am I able to support myself in accordance with my own values or spirit? Because we're looking at, the life as that space between matter and spirit. And this really is like a crux of that. And then she goes on to say, it has been said that every time you spend money, you're casting a vote for the kind of world that you want. Does a person's financial choices clearly reflect their values, or is it much more complicated? Individuals who have an emphasis on the 2nd house matters often encounter life lessons about the transformation of potential power into financial worth. And in a spiritual sense, the 2nd house can point us to techniques of prosperity consciousness.
I like that. Yeah, I think the main point of it is that while the 2nd house isn't the worst house, it is very complicated, and can, like Elsa was saying, just very quickly spiral into things that are bad for your life, basically.
Yeah. Money being the root of all evil, but yet like we have to engage somehow in order to have food, clothing, shelter, and those types of things. And like, what does our food choices and our clothing choices and our shelter choices, we have responsibility over if that aligns with our bigger intentions in the world.
So that's the first and second houses. That's I think everything that we need to say about them. If you want to have a more in-depth discussion with us, our next group is going to be on these two chapters. We're going to be meeting the last Wednesday of this month and every month going forward. At I think 7 p.m. Eastern time is the time we agreed on. So you can go find us on Patreon, and also is going to link that below.
Yeah, and all of our information is going to be linked below. So thank you for walking through the book with us. And if you want to know more, all the dates and all the specifics are over on Patreon, and our stuff is below. So thanks, y'all. Ciao.
Bye.
Ia mata o ka ka wat sama yo na pekena so